really fun guest today. I'm very excited to welcome John Ford and Mark Nickerson. So round of applause.
Thank you.
I have my cheat sheets, but I'm just going to kind of engage with you two. You've done 30 years as a Maine warden, is that?
20 years as a warden and 10 years as a sheriff. And
okay, so around 30-ish wearing a badge. How many years have you had a badge?
20 years.
So we've got almost 60 combined years of being able to boss around a lot of people in this state. I'm going for that too.
Yeah. Hey,
and they sort of individually had some really well-received books and put together this very fun tour. They've been going around the state together, entertaining crowds, educating, talking about past experiences, the way law enforcement has changed, the way the population is receiving it differently, and they brought books with them here today. So if you're in need of a book for yourself or a Christmas gift, please help yourself. If they run out, we'll get more for you. And I just want to say thank you again for being here. So welcome.
Thank you for having us. Thank you for having us. Good. Thank you. Just to give you a little background, I'm John Ford, and I was the better of the two cops. And
What wardens aren't cops?
just to give you some background on how we got started, I never thought I'd see the day that the two of us would be going around talking to people about our careers. But, you know, it's something that we're really having a good time doing. A lot of people ask me, how did you happen to become a game warden? What made you want to become a game warden? And, I don't know, is this thing working? Can you hear me okay?
I turned it down a little. Is it still okay? Yeah.
I can. Charlotte, can you hear me way up back? Okay. My wife's on here. She just turned 95 this week, so. I got to tell you that I originally came from York County, a little town called Emery's Mills. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. It's north of Sanford. Grew up along the shores of Mousom Lake. And back when I was a young kid, I can remember going down to my grandmother's house, and my grandmother would used to tell stories about my grandfather's career. My grandfather actually was the second police chief for the town of Sanford back in the 1920s. And it was a job that he had for a short period of time. Then he decided that he wanted to move on. The Maine State Police formed in 1925. And he became a Maine State Trooper in the York County area in 1929. Now, to give you some background on what patrolling was like in those days, I can remember my grandfather talking about it vaguely, because I was just a kid. But they, when they was patrolling in those days, they didn't have cruisers. They patrolled the area down there on Harley-Davidson motorcycles with sidecars for balance in the wintertime. They didn't have radios. So when he was patrolling out through Sanford, Springvale, Shapley, and out through the Lebanons and up through the Berwicks and that area, the only way that he knew he had a call to go on is if he went by the drugstore, if he went by the post office, if there was a red flag hanging off the telephone pole, it meant he had to go find a phone, call the barracks in Wells, find out what the complaint was, go take care of that complaint, then find a phone and call the barracks and let him know that he was all set. Now, that's a lot different than what law enforcement is today. If they didn't hear from him for 2 or 3 hours, they'd send another trooper on his Harley out looking for him. So that was the way that they patrolled. Well, hearing some of those stories kind of lit a fire underneath me that maybe, just maybe, I'd want to be taking a career in law enforcement. So my grandfather died when I was fairly young, and my dad was a part-time deputy sheriff for the York County Sheriff's Department. So I got to see a side of that law enforcement. When I was fairly young and starting school, my mom and dad got a divorce, as a lot of families had done. My mother married the game warden. So I got to see a side of that law enforcement. And then to top it off, we had a house where most people had cats and dogs running through their houses. My mother was a wildlife rehabilitator. That meant the wardens in the lower section of the state of Maine, anytime they had wild animals that needed to be rehabilitated, we got a chance to do it. And while most kids had, when we was going to school, while most kids had cats and dogs in their houses, we had critters like this. This was Susie. Susie used to like to hang out in the wastebasket, but Susie, all of our wild animals had the run of the house. And I can tell you that when I was in high school, I actually used to have a pet fisher that slept on my pillow at night. But I got to tell you, the one interesting critter that we had was a skunk. And it was a young skunk that we picked up. Her name was Molly. And Molly had the run of the house. She hadn't been descended, but she liked to stay underneath the couch in our living room. And one night the Avon lady came to the house, and she was sitting on the couch, and my mom and her was going through the catalog. Well, Molly came out from underneath the couch and began digging at her shoes. And the lady thought it was a cat, so she reached down, batted it outside the head. Molly scooted back underneath the couch. But you didn't do that to Molly because she's quite inquisitive. A few minutes later, she come out and put both paws inside of them shoes and began digging around. That lady looked down and saw that black form with that white stripe. She let a screech out of her that blew the wax right out of our ears. And I ended up taking the catalogs out to her car, and she never came back selling those Avon catalogs. Matter of fact, I think it was put on the do not call list. But growing up in that type of environment, I decided right off quick, I want to be a game warden when I get older. So when I started Sanford High School, and there's one of my classmates, Bill Story, sitting in this class today. Bill was in my class, and I was one of those guys, when I went to high school, I already knew what I wanted to be. And my mother made me take these college courses, and I could not for the life of me understand what in hell good English, algebra, geometry, French, chemistry was going to do in making me become a good game warden. So I was not the most studious person in class. Unlike Bill, I was at the lower end of the echelon when I graduated. But I can tell you that I was in chemistry class, and I was quite artistic. My mom used to draw a lot, and I liked to sketch. Whenever I had paper and pen, I was always sketching. And I was sitting in chemistry class, and I drew a picture of my chemistry teacher, a caricature drawing. And it wasn't a very pretty pose, and I'm not going to tell you what it was, but I got caught. And I was sent to the principal's office. We had a principal down there, and I'm sure Bill will substantiate this. His name was Ike Prescott. Ike Prescott was a big, towering man, bald-headed man. He never grinned. Whenever you saw Ike, he was stern all the time. And you couldn't get him to grin if you tickled his butt with a peacock feather. He was one of those stern guys that you just intimidated you. Now I got kicked out of chemistry class, and I'm sitting in his office thinking I'm in big trouble. And he came in, and he wanted to know, he says, what are you doing here? And I said, well, I got kicked out of chemistry class. I drew a picture of my teacher. Well, let me see it. So I showed it to him, and he broke out laughing. So apparently I had done something halfway decent, because it was Ike who gave me an extra credit of art, which gave me enough credits to graduate from Sanford High School. So, my dream of becoming a game warden, I finally got out of Sanford High. I went to work for American Cyanamid Plastics Factory in South Sanford for a while. Hated it. The Vietnam War was going at that time. I decided, you know what, I'm going to join the military because I want to see the world before I come back to Maine and become a game warden. I'm going to join the military so I can travel at government's expense and see the world for a change. So, against the wishes of my parents, because everybody, all my classmates, a lot of them was over in Nam fighting the war. It was a terrible time for the country. But I volunteered with the Air Force. In July of 1966, I went to Lackland Air Force Base in Texas, got off on the plane at 5 o'clock in the morning, and I had two drill instructors screaming at me that I thought, what in hell have I done to myself for 4 years? But I was at their mercy because I'd signed up, but I was at least going to get a chance to see the world. I went through my basic training, and I was sent to Biloxi, Mississippi to become a radar operator. And while I was at Biloxi, the instructor said, if you had 2 places in the world where you could go, where would you want to go? My first choice was to go to Vietnam and be with my classmates and do my patriotic chore. My second place was Alaska. And he says, why would you want to go to Alaska? And I said, because someday I want to become a game warden. And what better place to go than to Alaska, where you got all this wildlife, you got good hunting, you got good fishing, it'd be something right up my alley. And I can remember him telling me, he says, don't get your heavy Parker out, because where you're going, you're probably not going to be needing it, meaning that I'd probably be going to Nam. So my orders came, and I can remember calling back home. My mother was having a fit. She was sure I'd be one of those going overseas. My orders came, and she says, "Where are you going?" And I said, "Have you got a Maine map?" And she says, "What do I need that for?" I said, "Where?" She says, "I said, where in the hell is Topsom, Maine?" Now, I had joined the Air Force during a time of war to see the world, and I was sent to Topsom, Maine. Go figure. But I think it's God's way of putting me in the right place at the right time, because I was home more than I was in the Air Force, but while I was at Topsom, I was able to take the warden's exam in Augusta. At that time, you had to be 21 years old to become a game warden. You had to pass a written test, you had to have a background check done on you, and if you did those two things and qualified, then you'd be put on the eligibility list for a hiring process if they had one come up. So fortunately for me, God did put me here in Topsom. I was able to take the written exam in Augusta, and I passed it, and I was on that eligibility list, but I still wasn't 21, and I still had a year to go in the Air Force for their obligation. So they finally decided that they was going to close this little base you had up here in Topsom. And I thought, I'm finally going to get out of the state of Maine, and I'm going to see the world after all. My orders came, and I was sent to Charleston Hill, north of Bangor. So, you know, I had joined the Air Force to see the world, and I spent all 4 years of my career less than 150 miles from home. I think I got $2.23 in travel pay when I finally got discharged. But anyway, by then, in July of 1970, when I got discharged, I had turned 21. I came back to Sanford, and I worked for a little department store in South Sanford called W.T. Grant's. I don't know if you remember the Grant store. I was getting a whole sum of 75 cents an hour. Big pay back in those days. And, but it was a job that I hated, and I was still pursuing that dream of wanting to become a game warden. Now, Mark gives me the devil because I never let him talk, so I'm going to give him 2 minutes to tell you his side of the story.
And it's usually at the last 5 minutes when he gives up the mic, so. What's really interesting is the fact that we're in the year 2014, and here's John and I going around giving stories about our careers. What's interesting is the fact that his grandfather, being the local trooper down in southern Maine back in the 20s, 30s, 40s, his grandparents lived on Main Street in Sanford, and my grandparents lived 8 houses down the street from his grandparents, and they were good friends. And John's grandfather actually encouraged my father after World War II to get into law enforcement and mentored for my father. And my first, when my father got going in life after World War II, he actually lived here in Brunswick and had 2 service stations over here on Pleasant Street. And my mom was the bookkeeper at Center's department store here in town. So there's a little bit of history for Brunswick and my connection. But I want to tell you, when John's grandfather mentored my father and encouraged him to go into law enforcement, I want to tell you right now that the Ford name had a lot more respect back then than it does today.
You paid for that, I guarantee you.
And in 1953, my dad finally did he was a Brunswick police officer first, and then he met the likes of Eddie Marks and Bulldog Powers and Bull Knox as well here in this area. Because in Brunswick was a really busy area back after World War II, and with the naval base here and so forth, and there was a lot of bar fights. Yeah. And my dad was a big-sized man, and they encouraged him to come on, and he did. He joined the state police in 1953, and he was stationed in Vassalboro, Maine, which is where I was born and raised. And my dad was good friends with a lot of the original members of the department, and they were getting ready to retire at that time, or some were still on. And there were people like Merle Cole and Lloyd Hoxie, but the special guy is a fellow by the name of Eddie Marks. Eddie Marks came on in 1925. He was an original trooper, came on with his twin brother Charlie, and Eddie served 50 years with the state police, retiring in 1975. And my dad used to have what they call choir practice, but it was a little friendly game of cards every couple of months in the house. These gentlemen would come to our home and tell their stories. And as a little boy, I got to sit at the bar between the kitchen and the dining room and listen to those stories. But Eddie Marks always came early because he loved children and he loved to tell stories. And the special thing about Eddie is he was a man about my size. He had a completely bald head. He always had a wet, unlit cigar sticking out of his mouth that used to disgust my mother beyond belief. And he also had a 375-pound pet black bear named Minnie. And Eddie used to dress this bear up with a little reporter's cap and put a scarf around it, and he would chain it to the inside of the sidecar on the motorcycle and go on patrol with it. Now, can you imagine people's reaction in these small towns when this big bad state trooper is driving through town on a Harley Davidson, and Minnie the bear is riding right along shotgun with him? So one of the stories I will never forget as a little boy is he was telling about being on patrol with Minnie one day, and they came to a railroad crossing, and there was a train going by, the gate was down, and so Eddie stops the bike, and he gets off the bike to stretch his legs and so forth. And while he's off the bike, the train blew its whistle. It spooked the bear. The bear jumps out of the sidecar and is dragging his motorcycle down across the field. And here's old Eddie hoofing after it, trying to catch his motorcycle. Now, as a little boy, I'm pretty impressionable, and I thought, that's what I want to do right there. I want to be a trooper like this guy. And I told my dad, I said, Dad, he had all these envisions of me doing something different, and I said, no, I want to be a trooper like you guys. And he goes, no. And duty for my dad was 7 days on with 1 day off a week, and it was 24-hour duty, and believe me, I didn't see much of my dad growing up. And he says, I've got this friend that's a dentist, and he goes, he'll be looking for somebody about your age. You go through college, you become a dentist, you go to work for him, then you become his partner, and then he'll retire and you take over his business. And I thought, well, they make pretty good money. I guess I could do that. So I was in the pre-med program at Orono, and there was this class called zoology. And we were about a month into it when this professor took us in the back room, and there was this tank probably about this size, and he had us students go around this tank, and then he pulls the cover off, and there was this guy soaking in formaldehyde in there. And he says, we're gonna dissect this fellow. And I said, you guys are gonna dissect him. I'm out of here. And I probably went back to my dorm room, called my dad, and I said, whether you want me to or not, Dad, I'm changing my major and I'm gonna be a trooper. And he said, all right, I'll support you from here on out. And I did, and I became a trooper in 1977, assigned to Moosehead Lake, Northern Piscataqua County. So that's how. He gave me 5 minutes.
Now, who would have believed that some 40-some years later that he and I would get paired out in Waldo County and actually patrol together? I had to keep him out of trouble all those years. It was kind of hard. So, I got to tell you that, that if you stop and think about what Mac was saying, the state police formed in 1925. Now, a warden service formed in 1880. So a warden service had been going for several years before the state police ever thought of being. And I think the only reason that the state police ever formed was because they all wanted to be game wardens, but they couldn't hack the program. I mean, if you stop and figure any damn fool riding around with a black bear sitting beside him, obviously want to be a game warden. So, I tell Mark that's the reason why they formed their own. Well, how many troopers do you ever see get off the town road anyway? Because us game wardens had to do everything out in the woods, so. But it really, the times had changed so much. When I finally got down to Grants, I hated working at that store. And it was in September of 1970 that I was told there was going to be a couple of openings come up for warden service in the state of Maine, and that I'd be called to Augusta to go in for an interview. Now, my stepfather, who had been the game warden down in that Sanford area for 20-some years, he told me, he said, look, you're going to get called in for an interview. Don't think you're going to get hired on the first interview. They want to see if you're persistent enough to keep coming back, and to see if you're really dedicated enough that you will pursue the job and stick with it. So he says, you're probably gonna get called in there, don't think you'll get hired on that the first go round. So anyway, I got called in September to go to Augusta, and I went to the state office building. The Fish and Game was on the 6th floor. I can remember getting off in the elevator, and the chief warden met me, and that chief warden reminded me so much of Ike Prescott that was in high school that it was pathetic. And he had that same grumpy look about him. And he took me into the office, and he closed the door, and it was a real small office. There was no windows in there or anything. He sat down behind his desk, and I sat in front of him, and, you know, I was nervous, thinking that, you know, I want to make a good impression. And the first thing he did was he looked at me, and he winked, and he stared at me, and he said, "Are you single?" And that scared the hell out of me. And I'm looking for exit signs. Why would he ask me that, you know? And so I said, "Yes, sir, I am." And he said, "Well, that's good," because he said, "We've got a district, we're looking for a single man that might want to go into it." He said, "We have 2 districts that are open in the state of Maine," and he said, the first one is a little town called Daquan. Any of you in here know what Daquan, Maine is? Got one. Daquan, Maine, you have to go into Canada, and you have to come down along the border line on a dirt road, and there's 13 people that live there all year round. And you know, if I was to get that district, I'd consider that like my Air Force career. I wanted to go anyway. And he looked at me and he said, "Now I know a young fellow starting out wouldn't want to go into a district like that." He says, "But the other district we have," he says, is right in prime deer country. It's in the central part of the state, county of Waldo, the Burnham district. But he says, "I want to be honest with you, they hate game wardens. They hate them with a passion. There's a group of organized poachers up there that you can order deer meat off from any time of the year, and they will supply it. So a warden is a threat to their industry." He said, to show you how bad it is, he says, the warden that's living in our state camp in Burnham right now, he said 3 weeks ago, while he was out working at night, his wife and daughter was at the camp. At 11 o'clock at night, some thugs pulled up in front of the camp. They shot every window out of that camp with his wife and daughter laying on the floor. They want to transfer out of there, and we put it out for bid, and we can't get another warden that wants to move down there. So he says, "We're looking for someone single that's wanting to make a new start, that would like to move into an area where you hate it. Would that be you?" And I said, "Sir, I will go anywhere in the state of Maine you want me to." He says, "Good, when can you start?" And you know, when he said that, I could just feel my heart was just pounding. I thought to God I just won Powerball. I mean, I was so excited that childhood dream was finally coming to realization. I said, "How about tomorrow morning?" He said, "Well, how about you give WP Grants a 2-week notice and you report back up here, we'll send you into this district where they hate you." And I thought, well, that's a pretty good deal. So, now I gotta tell you, warden service back in those days, the day that I got hired, I met my boss at the Burnham Wardens camp. They pinned a badge on me. They gave me a little .38 revolver and a gun belt that I looked like Marshall Dillon, hung down to my knees, and a little summons book and an old beat-up cruiser, and they turned me loose on the public that day. No training. Now, in order to become a game warden today, you have to go through 36 weeks of academy training at his academy, State Police Academy, and then you have to ride with a warden for 12 weeks before they turn you loose on the public. I know after I wrote that book that probably a lot of my actions is what's responsible for that training they have today. But times were so much different back then. I mean, just to give you some example, the poaching industry in Burnham at that time, I knew the minute that I drove into the filling station on Main Street in Burnham that I was not a liked man. It was like the Black Plague that drove into the dooryard, and they all ran into the store, hid behind the bread counter, and couldn't wait for that damn game warden to get out of the yard. And so, you know, I knew right off quick that I had my work cut out for me. But also, I found out right off quick that these poachers, there was 2 different factions going. A lot of you can probably remember in the 70s, you didn't have the welfare programs that we've got today. You had a lot of families that had a lot of kids, and times were hard. And you had people that actually was killing deer that was using that deer meat as a means of survival for the family. So, and a lot of these were farmers. And I always figured that a farmer, if he went out behind his back door at night, listed a deer and dragged it into the house to use for the family survival, he wasn't a threat to my industry. And if he wasn't bragging about it, I wouldn't work too hard to catch him. What I was interested in was that group of fellas that was making a profit out of it. There was people that was in Waterville, Fairfield, Skowhegan, Pittsfield, and Bangor that was calling up and getting fresh deer meat any time of the year that they wanted from these people. So it was an industry. These people was organized enough so that usually around the 4th of July, when the peas first came up, they would have a little deer roast where they'd all get together. They would pool their money, and the night hunting season in Burnham would start full force. And it wouldn't end until the first blizzard hit sometime late in December. But these people would pool their money together so that if anybody got caught with a fish and game violation, rather than have that money come out of their pocket, it came out of their slush fund that they established between them. They was organized. They were so organized that I can remember my first night of working night hunters in Burnham. I was in that warden's camp that had the window shot out of it, and Norman Gilbert, who was my working partner from Heartland, came down and picked me up. And Norman, we had CB radios in our cars at that time. You know the radios the truckers talk back and forth on? We had those CB radios in our cars. And when we left that night to go out working night hunters at about 10:30 at night, Norman says, turn your CB on, you're not going to believe what you hear. And I said, no, Norman, what the hell am I going to hear this time of night? He said, turn your CB on. So I did. I turned that CB on, I went out my driveway, and I took a right. I went up to the end of the road. There's a little country store up there. And when I took a right to head out to the next road, I heard over the CB, breaker, 19. Redcoat just took a right at the store. Now the Redcoats was us. It was a red wool jacket that we wore in the fall. And I said, you gotta be kidding me. These people was monitoring to see where we'd be. I heard someone say, I'd watch the other end and said, tell you which way you go. So I get out to the Troy Road and I take a left and I head towards the village. I heard, breaker, 19, he just took a left. He was headed towards the village. And I'm thinking, God, this is everything my stepfather told me it was going to be. They're going to be playing games on you right straight ahead. So I thought I'd be smart. And I picked up the CB and I said, breaker, 19, he just took a left at the village. He's headed towards Benton. The voice comes over the radio and he says, to hell he did, that's you, and you get off of that radio right now. You know, and it sent a message to me right off quick. These guys are going to be a lot of fun. So in 1970, things were starting to change. I can tell you that in 1970, when I went to Burnham, if you saw an eagle in the 1970s was probably about as rare as anything you're going to see. Coyotes was something that we never heard of. The wintertime, snowmobiles was just starting to make their trend into the state of Maine. There were none of the clubs, there were none of the trails that we have today. And let me tell you, the department gave me a skidoo when I first came on, and that skidoo, if I opened that up full speed and went 35 miles an hour, I had what you call a screamer. And you know, they would really fly. You can get them today out of the crate that will do 110 miles an hour right out of the crate on a 4-foot wide trail that goes all the way from Fort Kent to Kittery. So, you know, I had that 35 horsepower screamer, and I was up on top of Fry Mountain. We used to have a tilt trailer, plywood platform we put on our boat trailers so that I could drive the snow sled up onto that, anchor it down, tow it around my district. If I wanted to get off and go on a woods road or something, I could do that. And I came down off of Fry Mountain. I had another warden riding with me that day, and I went to give that the throttle to go up onto my boat trailer, and the throttle stopped. And I hit that platform at about 35 miles an hour, and I shot up across it, went through the board at the end of it, shot across the trunk of my car, drove the skis through the back window, and launched myself onto the hood. Now, just imagine if I had one of those critters that do 100 miles an hour, I'd have been on Owlsboro looking for a ride back to the mainland somewhere. But can you imagine the boss when I called him up and said, hey Charlie, you know that snow sled I got? Well, I need 2 new skis, I need a new back window for my cruiser, my trunk needs a paint job, and oh Jesus, no, my knees hurt. So, you know, just that the times were so much different back then. And back in those days, I can remember the very first division meeting we had, that we was all sitting around the table, a bunch of the older ones was there, Norman Gilbert and a whole bunch of Reggie Mossy and a bunch from up in that area, and the chief warden was there, and he said, gentlemen, I got some bad news for you. This is in, I think it was 1971, and the guy said, now what? I mean, the chief warden never came to one of them meetings unless he had bad news anyway, but it was one of those things where he said, well, the Supreme Court has just made a ruling last week that from this point on, if you're going to accuse anybody of a crime, or if you're going to take them into custody, you have to read them their rights. You have the absolute right to remain silent. Anything you say can. The Miranda warning had come into being. Some of them old-time wardens who had been on for years before I got there, I can remember one of them threw his someone's book and banged on the table and he said, what in hell is this world coming to? Now we got to tell these damn fools they can't talk to us. And some of them quit. Some of them said, that's it, we've seen the better days, we're all done. Well, me being the newbie coming on, I didn't have a problem reading from a card, so I accepted that. And I can remember afterwards that, you know, the times had changed and it showed. Let me tell you how we used to do search warrants back in those days. When we wanted to search a place, what we would do is we'd go to the house that we wanted to search. 2 wardens would walk around the back of the house, and the other warden would go up and knock on the front door. When the guy knocked on the front door, the guys out back would holler, come in! And that was the way we did our search warrant. Can you imagine doing that today? I got telling that story about, I think it was Dan Scott at the library was talking down there, and I got telling that story, and unbeknownst to me, sitting in the crowd was John Atwood. Now, John Atwood was the district attorney for Waldo County for a period of time, and he went on to become actually the commissioner of the state police. He was Mac's boss for a bit, and then he was appointed to become a Superior Court judge. Well, I didn't know he was sitting in the audience. When I told that story, he jumped right up and he said, you tell me that didn't happen in our county when I was up there. So the times were changing, and it really was changing. I mean, I saw things that was so much different back in those days, and Mark had yet to go to that wonderful place they call the State Police Academy and get his training on how to become a good police officer. And you know, and I'll probably tell you a couple of stories. I had to train him. That academy didn't train him nothing. Most of the training that he got that really saved his skin came from me. And but anyway, you know, those times.
Turn yet?
Yeah, you want to talk? I knew he couldn't stand it.
About that training, I hope everybody's got their boots on today.
You know, when I was in the academy getting trained, because they sent us out after we'd been trained, but I remember the cadre telling us, you know, if you guys ever need any, you know, searches done that, you know, kind of like on the QT and so forth, go find a warden, because they had these magical search powers. Little did they know that the cadre apparently didn't know that all their search warrants, search powers that they had were illegal. So, and I actually have a story about that. I had to live that one time. I was, when I patrolled up north, I had this great case of stolen property, and it was a really big case. It involved lots of states and so forth. And I'd received this tip that some of this property was stored in a camp way up on north of Piscataqua County on Ross Lake. So one of the wardens said, hey, I'll fly you up there. And I said, great. So myself and the chief pilot and another warden, we pile into a plane and we fly up there. It's middle of the winter, at least 2 feet of snow, cold. And we landed on Ross Lake, and there's no sign of life anywhere. But we taxied around the lake, we found the camp that I was looking for, pulled up in front of it. There's no plowed roads, there's no footprints, there's no smoke coming out of any chimneys. And I said, well, that's the camp I'm looking for right there. So we go up. And I remember the chief pilot, he kind of went out behind the camp there, and Charlie and I, we went up on the porch, and Charlie bangs on the door. I heard this, come in. And I'm looking around, I'm thinking, there ain't nobody around here. But we went in, and there's all my stolen property, but believe me, I never dared to charge anybody because I would have lost it in court. But I like to tell a part about how, you know, John and I, we both have books out, and I like to tell how this sort of got started. Back in the day, John represented the Warden Service, and I was state police, and we had another good friend that was the Sheriff's Department from Waldo. His name was Jonesy. And we would meet anywhere and everywhere, parking lots or fields or restaurants, and yes, donut shops.
Yes.
And I actually have a story about a donut shop. When my little boy, he was 4 or 5 years old, and over in Winslow, they were building the new Dunkin' Donuts, and I had him in the cruiser with me one day, and my son was a cutie. And as we're driving by the Dunkin' Donuts that we're building, he says, "Dad, look, they're building you a new office." I still haven't forgiven him. But anyway, so John, we always used to meet and share information, and we solved a lot of crime up in that area. And so in 1990, John decided to pull the plug and run for sheriff of Waldo County. And he won. We're still recounting the ballots because nobody could believe that he actually won the election. But John wins. He's the new sheriff down in Belfast, and so we now have this fancy office that we can go to and put our feet up on the desk and tell really good stories. And but there was this lady by the name of Beth Staples. She was the editor of the local paper, and she used to come up and do her police beat story for the paper and so forth. And she would sit in on these bull sessions that we had. And after hearing them so many times, she finally said to John one day, she goes, "You know, John," she goes, "you ought to write these down. And I could give you a column in the paper, and you know, you could write every other week and so forth, and let the public read these, because these are great stories." And John, he hemmed and hawed, and he goes, "Geez, I don't know if the public should be reading about this stuff," you know. It's kind of like the behind the scenes thing. And so he was kind of hedging on it. So finally she says, "We'll pay you $50 a story." He goes, "I'm in." John started his writing career as he's High Sheriff of Waldo County. And I'm still an active trooper out on the highways and so forth. And when John and I had ridden together for so many years, a lot of his stories, he's throwing insults at me during his storytelling time. And the local people loved it. And I used to get razzed just about anywhere I went because, "Hey, we read about you, and that's what you really did." And so after a couple of years of that, Beth, she calls me up and she says, "You know, John's always picking on you in those stories." She goes, you must have a story about him." And I said, "How many do you want?" She says, "Well, why don't you write one?" I go, "Beth, I'm still an active trooper, and if I wrote a story, I'm sure the colonel of the state police is not going to appreciate anything I do." And she goes, "Well, why don't you write one anyway, and I'll edit it, make sure nobody gets sued, and we'll go from there." And I thought, well, what could they do? Make me a trooper and put me in unity? So I said, sure. So I wrote, my very first story went like this. As usual, I'm escorting or chauffeuring John around because it was always John Ford and the trooper showed up. And anywhere we went. And so we're patrolling one night and we get this call. And the call was a suspicious person in a vehicle coming up Route 220 in Liberty. And what he was doing was he'd pull into people's dooryard and he'd get out and he'd ring the doorbell or knock on the door, and then he'd jump back in his vehicle and go up and do it to the next house. And he kept doing that all the way up through 220 in Liberty. And so a lot of people had called in a complaint. So we had a good description of the vehicle and a good description of the guy. So we started into the area and took us 15, 20 minutes, and I had just crossed Route 3 and started down 220. And the very first vehicle we met matched the description we're looking for. It's like, there he is right there. So I flipped around and I did a traffic stop on the guy. And I approached the driver, and it was a middle-aged gentleman, matching the description we're looking for. And he looked like he'd been out on a fishing boat for about 6 months, and this was his first night back on land, and he'd been bending his elbow quite a bit. And he's what we call a keeper. And so I had him out of the vehicle, and he'd given me his license. And his name was Earl, and Earl was from Waldoboro. And I said, "Earl, I'm going to have you have a seat up in my cruiser, and we're going to have to go through an OUI process." He says, my name's not Earl, it's Oil. And if you don't call me Oil, you call me nothing at all. And I says, okay, Oil. I said, you're still gonna have a seat up in my cruiser. He goes, okay. Now, Oil, he was a happy-go-lucky drunk, and he was just lost, that's all. So Oil goes up and he has a seat in the front seat of my cruiser, and I'm behind the wheel, and John goes up and has a seat in the back, and I'm going through the paperwork, and I have to tell you that night I was suffering from a cold really bad, and I had a jar of Vicks between the seats. And as I'm making out the paperwork, Oil says to me, he says, can I borrow your Vicks? Now, I couldn't imagine why, but I said, sure, have at it. So as I'm writing, I'm kind of watching him, and he picks up the Vicks, and he takes the cover off, and he gets a great big blob of Vicks on his hand. And then he reaches over, and he smeared it on my uniform from my knee to my shoulder. And I'm looking at my uniform, and I'm looking at him, and because he's got this big smirk on his face.
Nothing like what I had.
Well, according to the law book, that's an assault. And when I landed on poor old Oil in the passenger seat, the seat breaks, and we land in John's lap in the back seat. And Oil's glasses go flying off, and Oil, he gives up. He goes, I give up. He goes, I was just having a little bit of fun. And I says, but Oil, I says, you're uncooperative now, and I gotta take you to jail. And I hated taking people to jail because it was just a lot more paperwork. So we get Oil handcuffed up and get the seat situated, and we're on our way to jail. And we hadn't gone 2 or 3 miles, and Oil says, he says, I need my glasses. I can't see without my glasses. And John pipes up from the back seat, says, got them right here. So John gives me the glasses, and I reach over and I put them on Oil's face. And he's all happy, and we continue on, but we hadn't gone 2 or 3 miles, and he goes, I think you hurt me. I says, well, what do you mean? He says, I can't see very well, my eyesight's all blurry. And I'm thinking, I said, you'll be fine, nobody hurt you. We'll, on our way to jail, we'll take care of it then. We go another 2 or 3 miles, and he says, no. He says, you've hurt me. He goes, my eyesight's all blurry, and I can't see anything. He says, you're in trouble, buddy. So at this point, I'm thinking, geez, maybe I did hurt him when I landed on him, you know? And of course, Nutsy here is in the back seat chuckling about the whole thing. We arrive at the jail, and I go to the passenger side of the cruiser, and I help him out. I've got him by the arm. And as we're going into the jail, he literally is walking into the door frame of the entrance. And we go inside, and he's walking into walls, and I'm thinking, oh man, I must have hurt him. So I turn him over to the jail personnel, and I turn to Numbnuts here, and I said, what is so funny? He goes, huh? He goes, I smeared Vicks all over his glasses. We never did tell Oil what we did to him that night. But after that story hit the paper, the first email I got was from Colonel Poulin of the state police. He said, please tell me you don't have any more of these stories. So that's when our writing career got started. Beth gave me 1 week, John was the next week, and we did it for 7 or 8 years up there, and the local people loved it. It's Johnny's turn.
Well, do you expect the academy would have told him how to prevent that guy from running? I mean, these are warden techniques. We had to learn our techniques right off quick. I knew that if Earl got out of that car and took off through the woods, it was going to be me to have to run him down. So I thought, I'll do a little preventive maintenance right now. I'll put some Vicks on his glasses so he can't see where he's going. Academy wouldn't teach him that. I constantly was teaching him new tricks. You know. Another one that I had to teach him, we work night hunters. Now when you work in night hunters, what you have 3 elements of the crime. You have to have someone that's searching for a deer after dark. They have to have a light, and they have to have gun and ammunition. And so we had this place down in Albion, off of the Bog Road, where there'd been a lot of night hunting in a great big green field. And across the road from that field, there's a woods road that went down through the woods, and it went down along the river, and there was some cornfields down there. Now the warden and I showed up down there at 1 o'clock in the morning, and we hit our car, and we're sitting in that green field waiting for maybe someone to come along and do the night hunting. Night hunting had been going on about 2:30 in the morning at that place. So we're sitting there patiently waiting. When we got the car all packed, we could hear a coon dog across the road from us that was down in that cornfield. And it's legal to hunt coon at night, with the use of a dog and a .22 pistol, so they weren't doing anything wrong. But we sat there, and pretty soon we heard the dog baying, had the coon treed, we could hear the pop, 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 and they shot the coon. Dead silence. There was only one way out of there, and that was that woods road that came out across from the field where I was at. So I said to the warden, I said, you know, I said, when they come up through out of there, just for the hell of it, we ought to hide in the ditch over there, and when they come out through, we'll jump up and check them and let them know that their tax dollars are being at work at 2 o'clock in the morning. So we did. We went over and we hid into the ditch, and pretty soon you could see the lights bouncing up through the woods and this pickup truck slowly coming our way. Well, we jumped up when it got real close to us, and unbeknownst to us, there was a guy standing in the back of the pickup truck with a loaded .30-06 rifle over the roof, waiting to see one of them deer in the field. Now that constituted night hunting. And when he saw us, he out of that truck, and he went across that field, and I right behind him. And I was baying like that coon dog, trying to get him to stop. We're zigzagging out through the field and into the woods, and he's got that rifle in his hands, and we're running, and I'm thinking, Jesus, where's he getting his wind from? And then I came to. He's right in the thick woods by now. He's using my light to see where he's going. So I stopped, and I shut my light off, and when I did, I heard smack. And I went ahead a little ways, and he's laying in the brush pile, and the rifle's over on the side, and he's out cold in the cucumber. So I pick up the rifle, and I'm sitting on a stump, waiting for him to come to, put the cuffs on, and drag him back to the car. So, lesson learned is that when these people are running at night, most of the time they aren't going to have light with them, so they're using your light to see where they're going. Academy didn't teach me that, and I had to teach him that. Before Mark came into the area, there was a trooper by the name of Dick Reachel that had that patrol area before Mark came in, and Dick came to my house one night, and he said, John, he says, I got an arrest warrant for a guy that's living in a camper that's committed some fairly serious crimes. He says, I know when I go and knock on that door, he's going to come out of the back of that camper, and he's going to run like hell down through the woods. Any way I can get you to sneak in behind the camper and be in position and ready for whatever happens. I love sneaking around in the dark in that stealth mode and wondering what the next few minutes is going to bring. So I sneak out behind the camper, and I heard him pound on the door and identify himself as a state trooper. And when he did, that zipper come open, that guy come out of there like he'd been shot from a cannon, and away we went. Down across the parking lot, into the woods, and down through the woods we was going. Dick was in between me, and he's got the light right on the guy's back of his head. So I hollered to him, and I said, Dick, he's using your light to see where he's going. Shut your light out. Shut your light out. He finally heard me, and he shut the light out. We heard the usual smack, and then we heard splash, and he ended up in the brook at the foot of the hill. We dragged him out of the brook before he drowned, got him back up there, and Dick gets me off to the side, and he says, I've got a problem. And I said, so don't I. I said, while I was running down through there, I said, I lost my portable radio. And he said, well, don't feel bad, I've lost my gun. So now we got a state trooper with no gun and me with no portable radio. He says, what are we going to do with him? And I said, handcuff him to that damn pine tree over there. He ain't going to pull that up. We'll go look for him. So we take the guy over and we put the cuffs around this big pine tree, and he doesn't have a clue what's going on. We just walk off and leave him. We're down there in the woods, and you can hear him hollering, hey, you can't leave me like this. You get your asses back here. He said, you can't leave me like this. So that's what we did. And we found our stuff, so.
I hate to say that he actually trained me, but he did on that one. I got in a high-speed chase with a drunk driver across Route 3 one night in Searsmont, and this guy goes off the road, and we're under this guy's lawn. We tear up the lawn, and out he goes in the woods. And this is like midnight, and we're running down through the woods, and I got my light right on the back of his head, and I just didn't have enough to grab a hold of him. And then I remember this really old game warden told me about shutting a light off, and I did, and it was textbook. It was smack and thud, and I stopped, and he was out cold with a big gash on his forehead. It was easy after that.
Did you think the academy taught him that? No, well, the game warden, correct. So, you know, I think most of those academy people, the only reason they was put in there, they couldn't hack it out on the road, so they made them instructors and put them in the academy. So. But you know, it really was an interesting career. Things was a lot different, and the times were changing all the way through. I mean, the Miranda warning came in, and we finally went to shift work. And It was in the 80s that we went to shift work, and I decided the great job that I had, that I loved, all of a sudden I'm told where I've got to work, when I've got to work. I was getting disciplined for working too many hours and putting on too much mileage. And I knew that if I didn't get done, I probably was going to be fired. So I decided at that point that I would run for the county sheriff. There was an opening come up, and it was going to be an election, and I thought, well, I'll run for sheriff. One of the most heartwarming things I think that happened during that bid for sheriff, I had my 20 years in so I could retire from warden service, but I got a letter from one of those hardcore poachers that I had dealt with time and time and time again in Burnham. And in that letter was a check for $200. And a letter said, John, would you please use this money towards your campaign? And we hope the hell you get elected, because then we'll know where the hell you are. So, you know, and I thought, well, what a great tribute to come to an area 20 years ago where they hated me, and now they're giving me money to go away. And, but you know, I got thinking about that. For that guy, for all the money that he'd spent in court, to have that, send me $200 out of his own pocket. That, what a tribute that was. But then I got thinking, he didn't do that. That came from that damn slut. They all came for it. So, you know, that was the way that it went. But, you know, we can go on with the stories of so many. We haven't even touched what's in the books. I mean,
Dynamite.
huh?
We got
Oh yeah, he wants, he wants me to embarrass myself further. When I was writing the stories, my stepfather, Vern Walker, when he was game warden in Sanford, told me, he said, John, you want to keep a diary. You want to keep a diary of those things that you really enjoyed the most about your job, because that time's going to go by so quick, you won't realize what you've done from day to day or week to week. And he said, 20 years will go by, and you won't remember half of this stuff. But if you keep a diary of those things that made the job, the great job it was, he says, you might want to write a book someday. And, you know, and so that's where the idea came from. I can thank him for that. And when I wrote the first book, Suddenly the Cider Didn't Taste So Good, there's a story behind that that's well worth reading. And when I wrote that, I told my wife, if we sell 50 of these, we're going to be doing good, and that'll be people in the area want to see if the family name's in the book. And but that first book, Island Port Press out of Yarmouth picked it up, and that first book in the 2.5 years it's been out, as of June of last year, it sold 18,800 copies. It's gone nationwide, and you know, I just never would have dreamed that. And the second book, This Cider Still Tastes Funny, is up to well over 8,000 copies. And so Mike and I are having fun going around, but I kept that diary, and I figured if I'm going to laugh at other people, I might as well put my own stupidity in there. Now, the story he wants me to tell you is, it involved a dead deer in the wintertime that was on the Sebasticook River. The Sebasticook River flowed from Burnham Village down into the town of Clinton. And something had killed this great big buck deer out on the ice during the wintertime. The ice was melting in the spring. The deer floated downstream, and it floated up onto a guy's lawn just outside of the town of Clinton. And it was our job to remove those types of critters at that time. Now, this was a hot day. I went to the house. They didn't give us trucks, we had sedans. That meant I had to drag that stinking deer up across the lawn, put it in my trunk, haul it off somewhere, and probably smell it for the rest of the summer. So when I got there was no one home. And I thought, you know, I could push that deer into the river, let him float downstream, but I knew if I did, it was going to be in the town of Clinton, then the whole damn town would be watching me gagging, trying to get this thing into the trunk. So I thought, what else can I do? Well, we used to dynamite beaver dams with, we had dynamite that we had, and I happened to have a couple of sticks of dynamite in the trunk of my car. Now, there was no one home, and I thought if I could get one stick of dynamite and get up there, and I'll cut that deer open, I'll throw that stick of dynamite into that deer's chest cavity, drag him back to the river, let him float away from the house, there'll be fish food downstream. So I did. I ran up, and I got my stick of dynamite, my wire, my cap, and my flashlight battery, and I went down, took a great big gulp of the air, got that dynamite in there, dragged the deer back into the river, and the current was really flowing strong. But rather than going downstream, the damn thing got caught in an eddy, and it's circling in front of this guy's house, round and round and round. And I knew that if I jumped in and tried to pull it out, I'd been in Benton before that deer ever hit quick. So I had no choice but to detonate it. And I did. Just as I did, Freddie drove into his dooryard. There was this god-awful boom. The sky was right full of chunks of deep water, and rather than come down into the stream like I planned on it, it all went over Freddie's lawn and deposited everywhere. And Freddie came around the corner of that house, and he called me names that day I'd never heard before, some I've never heard since. I knew I was going to be assaulted, and I figured probably I'd get fired. But I wrote about it. And I ended up actually taking Freddie's wheelbarrow and rake. His lawn never looked so damn good. I hauled old Bucky off up the road and dumped him into the woods up away from the house there. But I wrote about that in the book. Well, one of my bosses called me up and he said, John, he says, I can't tell you how proud I am to read about that era when we was all working together and to read about those good times that we all had. And I remember a lot of what you've written about. And I said, gee, Charlie, I said, that really makes me feel good. I said, but as I wrote that and read it myself, I'm wondering, why the hell you guys never fired me? And he says, well, as I read it, I wondered the same thing. But anyway, the book was out. I got my retirement check, and Russ Dyer, who happened to be a warden in and around the Sebago area years later, actually went on to become our colonel for the Fish and Game Department. Russ called me up, and he said, John, I just read your book. He said, that story about you blowing up that deer, he says, you don't know how that made me snicker. He said, that was the best damn thing I think I've read. And let me tell you why. He says, I put 6 sticks of dynamite in a moose on Sebago Lake. And he says, I know somewhere out there there's still antlers hanging from the tree. So we wardens kind of thought alike, and that was the way that the career went. And it really was a lot of fun. So.
You want a wildlife story?
You want to tell them your wildlife story?
John says I never get off the pavement, but I'm fine. But I got called to an accident one night down in South China, and when I got there, nobody around, but the vehicle was off the road upside down. And one of the things you're concerned about is somebody's been thrown out and they might be in the woods and injured or killed and so forth. So, and while you do a perimeter search, you call a wrecker to come and roll the vehicle over because they could be under the vehicle as well. So I did all that, and there was nobody around, and I ran the license plate and found out that the residence of the owner was over in East Vassalboro. I said, well, I'll just skip over there and take care of this. So I show up at the residence, and it was a beautiful home out in the country, and I knocked on the door, and this middle-aged lady answered the door, and she's very pleasant. And I identified myself and told her why I was there, and she goes, yeah, she goes, we've been expecting somebody. She goes, it was our teenage son who just got his license, crashed the vehicle, and he's here at the house. I said, well, I've got to talk to him. She goes, okay. So she invited me in, and I come into the kitchen, and they had this island in the kitchen. It was a really nice home, and I'm standing there, and she went and got her husband and her son, and they came in. And they also had this beautiful golden retriever who was very friendly. And he came up and he stayed right against my leg, and I pet him and so forth. And he wouldn't go away. So I petted him and was friendly, that's all. So the boy comes out, and I must have talked to him a good 15 minutes for him to explain the whole story of what happened and so forth. And after talking with him, it became evident that he violated a couple of laws, and I was going to have to issue him a summons. And I explained to the parents about what the process was and why I had to do this, and they go, no, we completely understand, and it'll be a learning lesson for them and so forth, and thank you for explaining it all. And so I said, well, I do have to write the summons, so I got my summons book out. And again, this beautiful golden retriever is right against my leg, and he's very friendly, but as soon as I put the summons book down and wrote the boy's name on there, it's like that dog knew what I was doing, and that warm feeling on my leg, started feeling really wet. And I looked down, and he was using me as a urinal right And I could never understand, the parents that you could watch the blood drain out of their face, and they run over with towels, and they're wiping me down, and offering to pay for the laundry, and I said, listen, I have a great sense of humor, and think of the story you get to tell after I leave here. That's my wildlife story.
You know, how long I stood there to train that dog on 3 hours. I got one quick while. How much time have we got?
Well, I just wanted to come in and see, you know, it sounds like you guys are cracking up still. Should they keep going a little while? Okay. It's fine with me. They also have books and donuts and stuff, so why don't, you know,
Donuts?
two.
Donuts?
Donuts. You said magic. We had to take the tray away earlier.
I got 2, Mike had 8.
So we have nothing in the room. We can keep going as long as you want. So
I'll just go another couple of stories, but
okay.
I want to tell my wildlife story. I mean, like I told you, my mom was a wildlife rehabilitator, so as a game warden, we had to do that a lot too. This is one of the critters that I raised at home, and raccoons and everything, but I think one of the most interesting stories that I had was in, I think it was March of 1984, early in the month. I got a call from the Dixmont Corner store, a little country store out in the town of Dixmont. And the lady that owned the store said, John, she said, a tree cutter just fell a tree up here in Newburgh. And when the tree fell over, 2 eggs fell out onto the ground. And it's an owl's egg, an owl's nest. And the mother is dive bombing him, but there's no way he can put them into the nest. So he scooped these eggs up and he's brought them to the store. What should we do with them? My first impression was to tell her to run to the back of the store, open the window, and wind them babies out into the woods, because chances are they probably never hatch. But people like to think they're doing great things for wildlife, and I said, why don't you wrap them in cotton, put them in a box, and put them in a warm place, and I'll be up in the morning and pick them up. My intention was going down Route 7, headed back home, I'd roll the window down, they'd go out the window at 60 miles an hour, and no one would ever know the difference. But the next morning, my phone rang early again, and it was her. And she says, John, you aren't going to believe this. She says, we took those 2 eggs, and we put them in cotton, and we put them in a box, we put them on top of the popcorn machine at the store. One of them just hatched, and the other one's hatching. Now, have any of you seen an owl right out of the egg? It looks like God was working and saying, I'm all done. I mean, it looks like little gobs of hand, little slimy things, their eyes aren't open, there's not a feather on them, big gummy feet, rubbery looking beaks, and they just sit there. And, you know, and I'm thinking, oh my God, how could anybody think these things are beautiful? So anyway, I ended up, by the time I got there, the other one had come out of the egg, and I called them for some reason, hoo-hoo and boo-hoo. And I picked them up, put them in a box, and I brought them home, and I thought, now what in the hell am I going to feed these? I didn't even realize what they ate at the time, so I called a place down in Ellsworth called Bird's Acres that deals with recovering things like that. And I got this guy on the phone, and I said, look, what do you feed a couple of owls that's hatched out of the egg on top of the popcorn machine at the Dixmont Corner store? And there was this long pause, and the guy said, sir, have you been drinking? And I said, no, I'm a game warden. He said, oh, that explains it. He said, they've got to have little chunks of meat, they got to have hair, they got to have bones, you got to get mice, you got to take the tin snips, cut up chunks of meat, hair, bones, and everything, and he says, you got to go back, take the tweezers, rub their beaks, and if they eat any at all, he says, you might make them live. Well, that was great. Then I'm thinking, you know, I know Hannaford's wasn't selling mice at the time, so where am I going to come up with all these mice and rats and all the rest of this stuff he's telling me about? So I put out a distress call in my neighborhood. I got some of the best neighbors of all the country. A lot of rats. And my poor wife would come home from work in the Bangor Savings Bank, and honest to God, she never knew what they'd find on the doorstep. There'd be bags of dead mice, squirrels, rats. Right, when I was on patrol, I was like a crow. Anything had fur on it was in the road, was in my trunk. And it got so bad as these things grew, I thought I was going to have to hire them burning poachers shoot me a deer to feed the damn thing. But they began to grow. And hoo-hoo and boo-hoo, I kept them in the box. And all of a sudden, little white feathers come out on them, their eyes opened, and they had these pretty blue eyes, and I thought, God has come back to work. And, you know, and I really got a little attached to them. And one night we sat watching TV, and one of them come waddling across our rug floor, leaving a trail of you-know-what behind it. Mrs. Ford threatened me with a divorce or a moving of the tenants was going to move downstairs. So I built a place, perch farm, down on my basement. And I was cutting up all this stuff, and I was going back and feeding them all the time, and they kept growing and growing. And as the summer went along, I wanted them to be released into the wild because I didn't know, I did know that owls, I don't know if you realize it now, that they'll live to be 35, 40 years old. And I had one kid in the nest, and I'll be damned if I wanted to have two more that I was going to be responsible for. So I didn't really want to get acclimated to them too much. But I wanted to make sure they could fend for themselves. So in my cellar, I had chicken wire put over the door so they could look out into the woods all the time. And as they grew, they obviously was the white feathers went to the brown and gray, and they was bad owls. And I thought, now I've got to teach them how to fly. Now, how do you teach owls how to fly? I had visions of getting on top of the woodpile by hours of doing this, but they learned how to fly on their own. So by then I thought, they're getting big enough, it's getting near the fall, I think it's time to let them go, but I want to make sure that they can fend for themselves. So what I would do is I'd take a great big chunk of gray squirrel meat, and I'd tie monofilament fish line onto that hair, and I would throw that up to the back of my cellar, and I'd pull that along, and that would bob up and down, and their heads, they'd watch that every movement, and their heads would bob up and down, they'd follow it, and they learned that if they flew down and just stood on the floor, it's like Meals on Wheels, and it's going to come to them. So all they do is reach down, pick it up, and swallow. So I thought, well, this ain't working out like I wanted to. So I began throwing bigger chunks up there, pulling it real quick. They'd come off in there and strike it with their talons. So by that time, I knew they was ready to let go. And this is the day I actually let them go. I don't know if you can see that. That's my son on the left. That's not the other owl, but if you look at that picture, it looks like he's looking at his arm like that makes a pretty good snack in itself. So. But it was one of the success stories, and God bless the warden's wife, because my poor wife went through it. You never knew. We had deer. I had a baby blue heron that I picked up. Maybe if you know what the blue herons look like, a prehistoric bird. And this was a young one, and she was working at the bank up in Bangor. And I said, honey, when you come home tonight, I got a baby heron at the house. And she says, well, where'd you put it? And I said, I put it in the bathtub. I run some water and it's standing in the bathtub. And she says, well, John, what if I want to take a bath? I said, well, push him over. He'll move over, all right? Not the brightest thing to say, because that heron never stayed at the Ford residence overnight. And I put him down on Unity Pond. I found him dead the next day, and I tried to lay the guilt trip on him, but it didn't work. So. But I mean, it was the life, the career was everything I thought it would be. I think Mac's career was everything he thought it would be. And we're telling you the funny side of the story, but there's some bad sides to it. I didn't want to remember the drownings, the suicides, and all of that stuff. That I wanted to remember those things that make us laugh. And and God knows there's so many of them. And a lot of them is at my own expense, and I'm not afraid to say that I kind of made a few goofs, and and I was able to write about it. But his book is right full of them. My book, and we haven't even gotten into the stories in the book. We could go on for hours. I'm writing the third book. He's writing his second book, and so I think the stories are there. A lot of people. I think if we can leave you as folks, if we can leave you with a smile on your face, enjoying the afternoon, then we've accomplished what we wanted to do. You don't need to hear the politics. You don't need to hear the gloom and doom. And the career was everything I thought it would be. My time, I think God put me in the right place with the right people at the right time. I mean, for me to get out of this whole big world, to get assigned to an Air Force base in Topsom, Maine, when I didn't even know where Topsom was. I mean, it just seemed like a fluke that everything happened. And when I went back and told my stepfather that day of my first interview that I had been hired to become a game warden, he couldn't believe it. Well, he did after he found out no one else wanted the district, no one else was take it. So, but everything worked out perfect. And, the thing was, I didn't take the job serious. Mark and I had a rapport with the people up there where we treated them with the respect that we would want to be treated with ourselves. We got a lot of that back. We, together as a team, solved probably more crime than any one department alone could do, and we did it as teamwork. People didn't care whether it's a green uniform, brown uniform, or a blue uniform. When they wanted help, they wanted help. I bailed him out of so many times. I want you to tell him about the fight you had when I was running for sheriff.
I don't know what you're talking
Yeah. You got anything you want to say?
No.
Okay. Well, look, we really appreciate it. I hope you've enjoyed it, and if anybody wants to sign books for a Christmas present, or I got my wildlife notepads, hey, we're here to do it. So thank you for coming. You've been great. We really appreciate it.